All right, I failed to mention Wednesday night, I had meant to and I forgot to, that the questions for verses 7 through 11 are on the back table. If any of you happen to walk by, you might have seen them. But hopefully, Lord willing, we will get into verses 7 through 11 this morning. Now, there's 1 Peter chapter 4, obviously, and then 1 Peter chapter 5 as well. Our goal is to hopefully, since we have 5 Sundays in the month of March, and we're on our second one, hopefully to finish 1 Peter. And if not, we'll miss it maybe by a class, hopefully. We're doing all right. All right, so last week we got as far as verse 4 and 5 of 1 Peter chapter 4. We've been studying how that Peter's addressing saints who are dealing with persecution and encouraging them to remain faithful despite the persecution, and allowing that persecution to continue to strengthen them and motivate them. And he uses the example of Jesus as an example of that persecution and dealing with the harshness of man, and yet still maintaining the path to doing what the Lord wants. We've talked about this as Peter has gotten into part of the proper priorities, I guess you could say, that these saints need to remember to have, how that they have been saved from their sins, they've been made clean. And of course, this is on the heels of 1 Peter chapter 3, where it seems as if his main thrust in describing Noah and baptism is the fact that you've been made clean. Don't sacrifice that. Okay, don't give that state up. Continue to stand against sin, because Jesus, he was determined not to sin, and as a result, he was willing to give of himself and ultimately his life, because he wanted to do the will of the Father. And that's putting the proper priorities in place. Instead of just saying, well, I'm willing to endure suffering, well, that may go up to a point. However, if I say, I refuse to not be faithful, I'm going to remain faithful no matter what, well then, no matter what the degree of problems we face, it won't matter if our determination is to remain faithful. And so in verse 3 and 4, Peter describes this lifestyle that we all once had, and ultimately that's really what this boils down to. All of us, before we became Christians, had sin in our lives. Whether we were given completely to it or not doesn't make any difference. Sin is sin, and sin results in spiritual death. And as a result, we were all in the same boat. Okay, whether we were like many of the Gentile Christians in revelries and drinking parties and abominable idolatries or not, the fact that sin was ruling our lives before we became Christians, that's not something we can really get away from. Now, in particular, I suppose that the application is emphasized in the minds of those of us who may have come to Christ later in life. Those of us who may have unfortunately made decisions in our lives where we didn't become Christians maybe early on, but maybe we did come to the truth a little bit later. And so maybe there might be an extra application for us understanding exactly what's being described here, as many of these Gentiles certainly understood what this was like. And then in verse 4, in regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. And our last question that we covered last week was question 3. Who is the they that think our change to be strange? Yeah, those who we used to spend time with, those whose friendships, maybe the relationship we had as friends with individuals, and maybe that no longer exists the way that it did. Maybe it's a group of coworkers that maybe we once used to do things together on the weekends or after work, and now for whatever reason whatever the observations that they're making, they see that something's changed, something's different. You don't do the same things that you used to. And you don't engage in the same behavior that you used to. And of course, we talked about the anger and perhaps sometimes a sense of betrayal, and certainly the idea that just by our example, that can serve to cause someone to feel condemnation in thinking, especially if they think themselves to be believers in God, okay, now all of a sudden you're acting differently because your faith has convicted you to do so, and you seek to serve God. Now all of a sudden that puts them in an awkward position to have to deal with, well, should I be like that or not? And if they want to reject that thought process, then they're going to reject you. All right. And of course, we talked about that term dissipation there. That covers question 4 as well. This is that term sometimes translated riotous or riotous living. Strong's defines it as unsaved,ness or unsaved character and conduct. Okay, same term we find in Titus regarding elders' children and what their life is supposed to be like. So that question 4, what does flood of dissipation mean? And obviously that unsaved conduct, the type of behavior that is indicative of the life of individuals who aren't beholding to what God has told them to do. Whether they consider themselves Christians or they consider themselves believers or not, their behavior speaks otherwise. And that flood of dissipation, that unbridled a lack of self-control, that lack of denial of desire, it's just a constant self-indulgence is really kind of what's being described there in in particular verse 2 and 3. What does this say about how we should be conducting ourselves in this world? What does that say about what our conduct should be? So much so that verse 4, that Peter observes that these individuals, they're speaking evil of you.
It's usually the same every day of the week, not just 2 days a week.
Yeah, consistency, right? Let your light so shine before men, Matthew chapter 5. And of course, the whole goal is to try to get them to think more along spiritual lines about God and about the Bible and about what our state our soul is in. And that's ultimately what the goal is. That's why Jesus says that they may glorify your Father in heaven. Now, sometimes, obviously, that's not going to be the case. Sometimes they're going to get angry and mad, and they're going to be angry at you as a result. But the idea that they can observe that change, okay, that change is such that it's something that stands out to them. All right, and then the consistent nature of that change. It's not like we were talking about New Year's resolutions, where maybe for the first week of January you start out and you're doing great, and then all of a sudden you start falling off around middle of January, and then you're back to your normal behavior. Okay, there's a consistency, a continual sense of now I've committed myself to something new, something different, something better for my soul. Yeah. Anything else through verse 4? Yeah, Debbie, go ahead.
This week, after the devastation in Tennessee, and I realize this isn't talking about persecution, but there was a posting by Wilson Adams, and he made the comment, this can either make you better or make you bitter. And that same thought occurs to me, these people who are going through persecution.
Yeah.
You can let it make you better, stronger, more faithful, more convicted, or you can let it make you bitter, or when people speak evil of you or treat you badly because you aren't the same.
Absolutely.
You can either become bitter or become better.
And doesn't that speak to the very first thing Peter acknowledges here in chapter 4? Okay, that we arm ourselves with the same mind that Christ had. And it wasn't just to suffer in the flesh via persecution. That's the end result of having the same mind that Jesus has. Ultimately, the mind that Jesus has and that we're to have is that being faithful no matter what. Okay, being committed to the will of the Father. And of course, Jesus was perfect all throughout his life. Our purpose and our goal is to strive for that same perfection, okay, to continue to better ourselves. Which means if we have that determination, then the application of persecution fits, but doesn't the application of trials of life as well? That if my entire purpose, my mind, is to be faithful to the Lord, then will it matter what's testing me? If I'm going back to my purpose, being faithful to God, even though my faith is tested via persecution, trial of life, issues in family, issues in my job, whatever it may be, That's going to be in the forefront of my mind, is doing what the Lord wants first, and then letting everything else just kind of fall where it may, because I don't have control over everything else. I don't have control over what other people are going to do, and I don't have control over tornadoes and events in life like that. I only have control over whether or not I'm going to be faithful to God. And if that's my mind, then I'm going to trust the Lord and commit myself to Him, and everything's going to go the way it's going to go. Yeah.
Michael, I think that's why it's so important that we make services, we read our Bible, we have relationships with our Christian brothers and sisters, because we get out in the world and it's good to feel left out, because you're going to be left out sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's times, I know everyone in their workplace feels left out because they aren't sitting around listening to all the dirty jokes and this and that's that go on in the workplace. So
Yeah.
you're going to feel left out, but that's okay
Yeah.
to feel left out, because we need each other right here in this room, in this place, and other Christians around the world to help us not feel left out. We're standing up for the right thing.
Right. Right.
And being at services and just being involved and trying to better ourselves will help with not feeling left out when you're in the world.
And isn't that one of the goals, especially given our human nature, whether we're social or what some people refer to as antisocial, generally speaking, human beings need contact with others. That's just kind of the way God made us. That being the case, one of the ways in which, especially in our day and age, and I'm not saying this was not applicable in the New Testament times either, but especially given how far apart many of us live, comparatively speaking, it's easy for us to probably get in the mindset that we're all alone in our daily things that we do. Okay, day to day, because we don't see the brethren every day, most of us, that may cause us to feel isolated. And when we start to feel isolated, the devil's right there waiting, because when we start to feel isolated, that's when he kind of gets us off like the 99 and the one that's kind of lagging behind. Now, I hadn't gone off yet, but packs of predators, what do they look for? Do they go after the strongest and the grouping of them? They go after the ones lagging behind, don't they? Okay, the ones that start to feel alone and isolated and maybe a little lost or discombobulated or whatever. They go after them. And that's what Satan's wanting to do with us as well. And Terry's exactly right. Being at services, at Bible class, helping to remind us we're not alone. And we have people who love us and who want to help us. And certainly, obviously, God foremost. But He designed the church the way that He did for us to all get to heaven together. Ben? Mm-hmm.
It engulfs everything.
Yeah.
And so it tells us that we're not going to be part of the majority. We're not going to be part of the masses and what they're doing. We have to be set apart.
Yeah.
And this kind of gives us that reminder.
And you're right. There's a sense in which man, if left unchecked, in himself, a lack of self-control, a lack of discipline, there is that flooding in of self-indulgence. And then when you get groups of people together and they all have that same mindset, it really is a flood of dissipation, both inwardly and outwardly. Okay, and certainly there are many examples that we can look to of in our world and maybe even our day-to-day life of people we know who give themselves continually to this self-indulgence. And in many ways, it is reminiscent. I don't necessarily think that he's calling back to earlier in 1 Peter chapter 3 about Noah and the flood, but the idea of why was it that God destroyed, what was it that God observed in Genesis for the reason that He destroyed everything? The hearts of man was evil continually. There was no self-control, there was no discipline, there was no thought to what God wanted. All they wanted was what was pleasurable for them. They wanted they just indulged themselves continually. There was no check there. There was no stopping of that thought process. And in many ways, our society, obviously societies have kind of carried forward that same thought process in many ways ever since. Ever since even after the flood. But fortunately, there has always been a remnant that is mindful of what God wants from them. Anything else through verse 4? Verse 5, they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. All right, first thing that we want to talk about, especially on the heels of chapter 3, is question 5 on our notes. Does verses 5 and 6 teach that purgatory exists? And this is one of those passages that those who do hold to purgatory, and this isn't just a Catholic concept, there are those of multi-faiths, if you will, or multi-backgrounds that have a tendency to believe in a purgatory type place. And the verses that they use comprise of 1 Peter chapter 3 regarding Jesus preaching to those in prison, and they liken that to purgatory. And then also here in verse 5 and 6, in particular, verse 6, this reason the gospel was preached to those who are dead. Okay, well, they died, but they kind of came back to life in purgatory to try to make up for their evil deeds. And so somehow or another, Jesus went to them and preached to them. That's kind of the prison that Peter speaks of in 1 Peter chapter 3. Is this speaking of a purgatory type place? What are the only two places we read about regarding where the dead go when they die? Sorry? Paradise. And what's the other one? Torment. Okay, torment. All right, those are the only two places we read about regarding when people die. It's a realm called Hades. Okay, that covers both sides of it. In the Old Testament, it's referred to as Sheol, or the pit. Okay, and then you have paradise and you have torment. Those are the only two places. There isn't some third midway option that we ever read about in the Old or New Testaments. And so the idea that somehow it's necessary to infer here that Peter's describing some third option, that doesn't fit within the context, first of all, of what Peter's describing. Again, this is all motivation to remember that these saints dealing with persecution, their goal needs to be to remain faithful. Purgatory isn't going to serve that option. Okay, if anything, it could serve the opposite reaction in that, well, you don't have to be perfect, and if you kind of slide a little too much, don't worry, you'll have a second chance. It doesn't fit. Is the gospel being taught to those who have died so that they can have a second chance to right their wrongs? And how, if somebody were to bring this up to you, how would you try to approach this? Especially given the context. Okay, verse 5, who's the they? They will give an account. Who's they? Okay, these people who once were our friends, once that we acted and behaved in a way that was unsaved, okay, before, they will give an account to him. So is he speaking about people who are currently living, people who are currently speaking evil of us, who observe us, and instead of allowing it to prick their hearts, instead they turn to anger and malice? Okay, these are people who are currently alive. But then he says, who is ready to judge the living and the dead. All right. Well, let's deal with the obvious first. Is Jesus, and of course Jesus is the one before whom we will all answer, is Jesus prepared to judge the living and the dead physically? Will all be raised and all stand before him in judgment? Yes. Okay, so yes, physically that is true. However, do you think that's what Peter's describing, that he's specifically bringing out the living and the dead physically? Because that's kind of the crux of the argument about purgatory here, is that Peter's describing living and the dead physically. And so when he talks about the dead in verse 6, these are the physically dead in purgatory. Okay, so this is how I would approach it if you were going to describe or talk to somebody about this concept and they utilize 1 Peter 3 and 4 as the basis for them thinking this. I would go to this crux of the concept of verse 5 and 6 in particular about, well, is he prepared to judge the living and the dead physically? Yes, of course he is. But are they going to be dead when they're judged? No. We're all going to be raised. Okay, and those who are living, they're going to be there too. Everyone's going to be in the exact same state. It's not going to be living and dead physically. Everybody's going to be raised, they're going to be judged, and then sentenced or justified, depending on how they lived. That being the case, is he prepared to judge the living spiritually as well as the dead spiritually? Yes. So what category would the individuals to whom Peter's writing, where would they be in that living or dead spiritually? To whom he's writing?
The saints are alive.
Okay, so the saints are alive. The ones that are reading this, they're the ones who are living. Now, the ones that he's referring to as being angry at us and speaking evil of us, they think it's strange, what category would they belong to? The dead. Yeah. These are the dead spiritually. Now, is this meant to, should we feel some sort of satisfaction or happiness or joy that people are going to lose their souls in judgment? Is that why Peter's describing this? Don't worry, you'll get back at them. Should we take pleasure in the thought that those who persecute us, given the context, or cause us issues in life that, oh, you're going to get yours, just you wait? Is that why Peter says this?
When is the gospel is preached to them, same as it was to us?
Which means what's the goal then? To save them. Absolutely. Just as much as someone took the time to teach us. I mean, notice, given the context, he's describing these individuals that we once spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles. How did we get out of that? The gospel was taught to us, right? Whether it was by a friend or a family member, somebody loved us enough, cared about us enough, and ultimately God cared about us enough to enable us to hear the gospel. And it helped us to understand what we needed to do to be saved. And so when we read in verse 5 and 6, understand that all are going to stand before the judgment. And that's all he's saying. When he says they will give an account to him, okay, this isn't the sense of just take pleasure in the fact that they're going to be sent to hell for this. Okay, that's not his point. His point is that God is prepared, Jesus is prepared to judge all. Both those who are spiritually alive now in Christ and those who are spiritually dead now in sin. That being the case, verse 6, for this reason, okay, because this fact exists, the gospel was preached also to those who were physically dead. Is the gospel being preached to physically dead people? See, there's where verse 5 and verse 6, that same thought process carries into verse 6. It's the spiritually dead. This is why the gospel's preached to the dead. Okay, those who are well, do they need a physician, Jesus said? Of course, the ironic point Jesus was making is that we all needed a physician ultimately. But in particular, those who had the wrong idea, the wrong understanding of what repentance meant, of trying to justify themselves by their works and so forth. Okay, everyone needs to be healed. Everybody needs to come to the knowledge of the truth for salvation. So when he says, for this reason, the gospel is preached to those who are spiritually dead. What's the reason, or why is it that this happens? Because Christ is going to judge all. And that's not a good thing for those who are spiritually lost. That they might be judged according to, now notice the second part, and they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. So what's the point? What's the goal? Break it down for a second. That they might be judged. So verse 5, when verse 5 comes to pass, okay, this judgment that happens, especially as it pertains to what the goal of the gospel is, to bring people to salvation. That the ultimate goal, that they may be judged according to men in the flesh. And then there's a contrast. But live according to God in the Spirit. So are we talking about living and dead still? Is there still that contrast of those who are spiritually dead versus those who are spiritually alive? I suggest that there is still that suggestion, that contrast here. That they, who's the they? The dead. Not physically, spiritually. That they might be judged according to men in the flesh. How would they be judged? Notice Peter doesn't say that you may be judged, that they may be judged. Whose are they? Who's our they? Those of verse 4, those who are spiritually dead, that are persecuting us, they think it's strange, they don't understand, they're angry. Okay, well, the gospel was preached to us when we were in that state. All right, well, the gospel needs to be preached to them as well so that they could be judged according to men in the flesh. What kind of judgment will we receive by men in the flesh generally for our faith? Persecution. They'll think you're strange. They'll speak evil of you. That's what he's speaking to in verse 6. You will be judged. Notice that judgment in this case, in this context, this is injustice. Okay? This is a lack of righteous judgment. You'll be judged according to men in the flesh. So while you're in the flesh, when you've come to the truth of the gospel and you embrace that truth and you live it, well, men in the flesh are going to judge you. They're not going to like that. But what is the point? What's the ultimate goal of the saving of the gospel? That you may live according to God in the Spirit. Okay? They may persecute your flesh, but can they do anything about your soul? They can't do a thing to my soul. All right? This is part of what Romans 8, when Paul describes nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Okay? And he talks about persecution, sword, famine. Nothing can separate us. Man has no power over my soul. But it's notable that Peter doesn't say you in verse 5 and 6. It's they, which suggests that what's his... This is right in hand with 1 Peter 3:15. What is the purpose of talking about this? If it's not, hey, don't worry, these people will be sent to hell and you'll be glad. If that's not the point, then what is? Everyone deserves the opportunity to hear the gospel. And so despite what they're doing in verse 4, what should I be doing? Sanctify God, the Lord God in your hearts. Be ready to do what? To give a defense for everyone who asks for the reason of hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. Remember, we talked about that back in 1 Peter 3:15, given the context that this is, in spite of the persecution, continue to teach the gospel. Continue to be able to share it with others. Well, that same thought process exists here in verse 5 and 6, but Peter, in a lot of ways, Peter makes it even more personal. That these aren't just random neighbors. These are people close to you who maybe once were friends, but are now lashing out at you. Even they, do they deserve anger and malice from us? They deserve the gospel because, and here's the sad, and this is what is meant to be evoked. Here's the sad part. They're going to give an account of it. And if we don't want to see them lost, and we shouldn't want to see anybody lost, then we need to make sure that they have that opportunity to hear the gospel too. Anything through verses 4, 5, and 6. Okay, and so in discussing this with somebody who uses this to describe purgatory, ultimately just ask them how does that fit within the context? Why would Peter randomly start talking about some third place when in fact he's actually encouraging the saints to understand that everyone needs the opportunity to hear the gospel? It doesn't fit within that text. Let's see. Question 6. Is the Lord ready to judge the living and the dead physically? Is he ready to do that? Sure. Yeah, he is. Okay. When he comes back with the trumpet of the Lord, He's not going to set foot back on earth. Paul tells us, where will Jesus be? How far will he come? In the air. Okay? Nothing ever says that he's going to step foot back on earth. But he is prepared to judge all, both living and the dead. What about spiritually? Is he ready to judge those who are prepared to go to heaven and those who aren't? Yep. And of course, which do you think Peter's talking about, verses 5 and 6? Spiritually dead. The spiritually alive and the spiritually dead. And that helps us to kind of anchor the rest of this context, especially towards those who are misusing it. Final question for our notes. Question 7 is, if Peter is referring to spiritually dead in verse 6, then what does he mean by the gospel being preached that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit? Isn't he actually kind of saying that the whole goal is that they will eventually be just like you? You're being persecuted by them because you've changed your life and are now living in the Spirit, and they don't like that. But the whole goal is to teach them the truth so that they'll actually end up joining you and be saved in the Spirit even though men reject them. All right. Anything through question 7 or verse 6? All right. Moving on to verse 7. And verse 7, in many ways, again, keep in mind, chapter headings are put in by man, and we understand that. In a lot of ways, if it wouldn't have made chapter 3 too long, verse 6 should have been the end of chapter 3, because the thought process continues. Okay, the very same, he's building on all of that from chapter 3 into that first part of chapter 4. And in many ways, starting in verse 7, he's still building on what he's saying, but now he's kind of looking forward, or helping the saints to look forward to what's coming. Okay, the end of all things, he says, verse 7, is at hand. Therefore be serious and watchful. Should we as Christians always be watchful in the sense that we're prepared for Jesus to return? Yes. But what does Peter say about being serious and watchful specifically? In your prayers. What does that mean, to be serious and watchful in your prayers? Does this mean I can't just randomly pray to God and tell Him about my day and some of the things that I've been tempted by? Is that not serious enough? That it needs to be a formal prayer, maybe the Lord's Prayer, and that's what I have to read because it needs to be serious? What does he mean?
Isn't it the application of our very thought all the time is toward Him, staying pure as best we can?
Okay. All right. And why is it, I mean, out of all of this from beginning of chapter 3 on through, in a lot of ways, all of 1 Peter in some ways, this is really the first time he's talked about prayer and the characteristics involved in our prayers. Why is that important? Why all of a sudden start talking about prayers? Especially given the statement that he says that all things is at hand, the end of all things is at hand. Why does prayer matter?
Prayer is your avenue to speak to God, to pour your heart out to God, to, tell Him your needs and wants, and not so much that He needs us to tell Him because He knows, but it's reminding us of how much we need Him.
Yes. When it comes...
Plus, if we're going through persecution, from friends or family, whatever, being able to speak with God will give us the courage and the strength to get through whatever.
Okay, Acts chapter 4 is a great example of that, with the threats made against Peter and against John. They go back to the rest of the apostles, say, here's what they said, and, these threats that were made, and they offered up this prayer to God, right? And they went out boldly after that. Of course, God, and not even in so many words, He told them He was there with them, shook the place. So,
When Jesus was on the cross, He spoke to God.
He spoke to His Father, didn't He?
When Stephen was being stoned, He spoke to God.
Mm-hmm. Can I be a faithful Christian without prayer? So then, is it safe to say that having I'm going to use these terms because it's best described this way. Having a continual, consistent prayer life is essential for me to be saved.
Pray without ceasing.
Pray without ceasing. Of course, that doesn't mean I'm praying 24 hours a day, but as it was already mentioned, if I'm continual in my prayers, okay, and I don't hesitate when I have the opportunity to pray to God, especially in the midst of my day, if I'm being tempted, or if something's come up and for whatever reason I'm stressed out over something that's just happened or whatever, and I pray to God, if I train myself that my first thought needs to be to go to God, okay, will that then help me in occasions of life when temptation hits immediately? Not just when I can see it coming, but when I turn the corner and there it is, my first reaction will be to think about God. All right? There are numerous occasions in the Old Testament where we have example of kings who should have conferred with God first before they did things, but they didn't. And because they didn't confer with God, they ultimately suffered for it. Okay? There's numerous examples that we can look to that show where people who are of faith, they first look to God. Okay? They seek His guidance, they seek His counsel first in everything that they do. And it helps us to understand and to appreciate the fact that can we enter the most holy place ourselves with Jesus' help? Isn't this part of what the Hebrew writer describes in Hebrews 9 and 10 about being able to enter the holy place? Okay? That we have a high priest, Jesus, and He helps us. He intercedes on our behalf. He knows what it's like to be human. He was in all points tempted as we are. Okay? That avenue, and I'm not going to say it's the most important aspect of our lives as Christians, because obviously there are multiple important aspects of our lives as Christians. But to say that without prayer we cannot be a faithful Christian is not an understatement. Prayer needs to be an essential part of our life, and it needs to be a consistent prayer. Not just when every now and then when something bad happens, oh Lord, I need you, please help me. Okay, yes, He's there for that, but when also should we be praying? In the good times too. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, right? If we were adapting that as Christians, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and I was looking to God and thinking about Him. Okay? That idea of making sure God is in the forefront of our mind will help us in every aspect of our life. Had David thought about it when he was standing on the balcony and saw Bathsheba, had God been the first thing that came to his mind, what do you think he would have done? Turn around, go lay down. You don't have, it's like I tell my kids, they come in, they'll be one, Dad, I can't sleep. Well, you know what? You don't have to sleep. You have to go lay there. Okay? You have to go lay there. And that's what I'll tell them, and of course they go back to sleep. But David, you don't have to sleep. Just go back and say a prayer. Keep your mind pure, and one of the ways to keep your mind pure is to do what? Talk to God. That's a great way to keep your mind pure, especially if you're in the midst of being tempted. Talk to God. Okay? It'll put your mind in a spiritual state and help you fight temptation. And yet, okay, the human part of us doesn't want to do that. David's a case in point there. So when Peter says in verse 7 that the end of all things is at hand then, thus be serious and watchful in your prayers. I better get an extra minute, Terry. What does he mean by the end of all things being at hand? That's question one of our questions. What is the end of all things?
Either our life or the end of time.
Okay. The end of time certainly is applicable. The end of our lives is applicable, especially given persecution. That some of these saints may be persecuted even to death. All right. A lot of times people focus in on this concept of at hand. And they liken it to when John the Baptist was going through the wilderness. And you remember what he was saying? Kingdom of heaven is at hand. And in relative terms, was it literally at hand? Yeah, I mean, it was, in relative human terms, it was at hand. Because within the next, well, you know, for all intents and purposes, 3 years or so, 4 years, is when Jesus started his ministry, and then he died and was raised and ascended to heaven. The church was established, okay, in Acts chapter 2. So the kingdom being at hand, that opportunity to enter into that kingdom, certainly is a part of what John was describing. But the phrase itself, at hand, does that necessarily imply an immediate, like it's right around the corner next week, next month? Is there some sense of an actual timeline with the phrase at hand? Couldn't I say anything that could happen at any point? It could happen in 5 minutes from now. It could happen in 500 years from now. Couldn't you use that same phrase to describe the lack of understanding at how soon it could be here? It's at hand. Okay, if it could be here at any moment, that's at hand, isn't it? We don't know it's going to be 500 years. It could very well be 5 minutes, right? And so, and I suggest that absolutely the idea of them dying certainly is part of that thought process, in that would be the end of all things for me, wouldn't it? But I suggest that Peter's specific thought process here is understand that Christ is coming back. And isn't it interesting that that's on the heels of verse 6, in particular verse 5 and 6, which Peter describes what? Judgment day. Okay, in verse 5, they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. That's when he comes back. That's where judgment day comes. And so the necessity, and here's where the urgency comes in, is that we don't have all the time in the world. Whether our life ends or Jesus comes back, we do not have all the time in the world. And it's that old cliche that everybody always says. You think you have all the time in the world until you don't. Okay? And that concept is very real in verse 7, especially given the urgency to talk to others about the gospel. The end of all things is at hand. Understand that this is, for all intents and purposes, the end of all things is soon. Okay? That being the case, be serious and watchful in your prayers. Why? Aside from the fact of how important prayer life is, why should I be serious and watchful? Because the end of all things is at hand. Why should that encourage me to be serious and watchful in my prayers?
So I'm always ready.
Okay, so I'm always ready, which speaks to what is my priority? Getting to heaven, right? And being faithful always, at the same mind Jesus had. Is it easy, especially when things are difficult, is it easy to lose sight sometimes of our priorities? Okay, especially when you're dealing with multiple reasons for being stressed out and things that are constantly on your mind and this whole list of things that I have to take care of. Is it sometimes easy to kind of lose track of what my priority is? Yeah, it can be. But will prayer bring me back to remembering what my ultimate goal is? Will I always have my job? No, I won't always have my job. One day I'll die, right? Will I always have my home? Always have my car payment? Okay? All of these stresses and sources of distraction, stop it, Terry. All these sources of distraction, they're in the immediate time. But what am I looking forward to? A home in heaven, which means that all of this stuff now, does it really matter? No. So remember that, and prayer will help us do that. Okay, prayer will keep us focused on God and on heaven, and it won't make all of this stuff, it'll be a lot easier to deal with. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with verse 8 next week. And don't forget those questions for 7 through 11 are on the back table also. Thank you.